The shareholder agreement was only 4 pages long. I'd signed it 23 years ago at our kitchen table, the same table where my husband later told me he needed more space in his life. I never thought those 4 pages would matter. I was wrong about that, the same way I was wrong about a great many things. My husband asked for the divorce on a Thursday evening in October. He had chosen Ancora, the waterfront restaurant in Vancouver we used to go to on anniversaries. I remember thinking, as the hostess led us to our table, that he had picked somewhere expensive because he felt guilty. I was still making excuses for him even then. He waited until the wine arrived. He picked up his glass, set it back down, and looked somewhere past my left shoulder when he spoke. He said he had been doing a lot of thinking. He said he felt like he had lost himself somewhere along the way. He said the word space 3 times in 4 sentences, as though repetition would soften what he was actually telling me. I looked at him across the candlelight. At 51, he was still handsome in the way that men who have always been told they are handsome tend to be comfortable in it, a little careless. I had loved that face for 23 years. I had sat beside it in a Kelowna hospital waiting room when his mother had her hip replaced. I had held it between my hands on the night he told me his father's company was failing and he didn't know how to save it. I knew every line of it. I set my fork down quietly on the edge of my plate. "All right," I said. He blinked. "All right? If that's what you want, then all right." He had clearly expected something else. Tears, perhaps. An argument. Some form of negotiation. He opened his mouth and closed it again, and I watched him recalibrate in real time. Watched him search for the version of this conversation he had rehearsed. I didn't give it to him. I folded my napkin and placed it beside my barely touched sea base. I picked up my bag. I told him I hoped the wine was good and that he should enjoy the rest of it, and then I walked out of Ancora through the front door and stood on the seawall for a long time watching the lights on the water, breathing cold October air until I could breathe normally again. I did not cry until I was in my car. And even then, I didn't cry for long. I want to be honest about who I was in that marriage, because I think it matters. I wasn't a saint. I was a woman who had made a particular set of choices over 23 years, and those choices had slowly, I had met my husband in our late 20s when he was still working for his father's logistics company, a mid-size freight operation based in Burnaby that moved goods between the lower mainland and northern BC communities. He had ideas for it, real ones, the kind that required capital and patience and someone who believed in him when the banks didn't. I was a nurse at Vancouver General by then, 4 years into my career, and I had just inherited a modest amount of money from my grandmother, a woman who had come to Canada from Scotland in 1962, with almost nothing and had spent the rest of her life being quietly, stubbornly careful with every dollar she earned. My grandmother had left me $85,000. It was not a fortune. It was everything she had. I used it to help my husband keep his father's company alive during the first restructuring. Our family lawyer had suggested we formalize it. And so we had a shareholder agreement, drawn up properly, acknowledging my contribution and establishing a 40% ownership stake in what would eventually become Pacific Freight Solutions Incorporated. My husband had signed it without hesitation. He had kissed me on the forehead afterward and said I was the only person in the world who truly believed in him. For a long time, that was enough. More than enough. The company grew. My husband was genuinely talented at what he did, building relationships, reading contracts, understanding what northern suppliers needed from a freight partner in ways that larger national carriers never bothered to. By our 12th year of marriage, Pacific Freight had 37 employees, contracts with 3 provincial government agencies, and a reputation in the industry that had taken years of 7-day weeks to build. I had been beside him for every one of those years. I had adjusted my shifts at the hospital to accommodate his travel schedule. I had turned down a nurse practitioner position in the oncology unit at BC Cancer because the hours were incompatible with the life we had built. I had hosted dinners for clients I didn't know, learned the names of their wives and children, sent Christmas cards with personal notes because he always forgot. I had done all of this without keeping score, because that is not how I understood marriage to work. I understand now that I should have paid closer attention to how he understood it. The changes were gradual and easy to explain away. He started traveling more. He became distracted at home in a way that felt restless rather than tired. He stopped asking about my days at the hospital, and when I mentioned patients or colleagues, he would nod and look at his phone. I told myself it was the pressure of a large contract. He was pursuing a major freight deal with a northern resource company. The biggest single contract Pacific Freight had ever bid on. The Pemberton contract, he called it, as though it were a person. His assistant called me the following February to remind me about a dinner reservation I knew nothing about. She was new to the job and clearly mortified when she realized her mistake. She apologized 3 times and then very carefully said nothing else. I thanked her and hung up and sat at the kitchen table for a while. I didn't ask him about it that night. I watched him come through the front door, in the way that I had watched him come through the front door for 23 years, and I made dinner and we talked about the weather and the hockey scores and whether the gutters needed cleaning. And I lay awake beside him until 2 in the morning thinking about all the things I hadn't said. I started paying attention differently after that. Not snooping, not going through his phone. I didn't have the stomach for that kind of investigation. But I began to notice the texture of his absences, the way he angled himself away from me when he typed, the particular quality of his silence when I asked questions. I had spent nearly a quarter-century learning this man's rhythms. I knew what was wrong, the way you know when a patient's breathing has changed before the monitor alerts. I just didn't want to know. My sister-in-law called me on a Sunday afternoon in March. My husband's younger sister and I had always been close in the easy, undemonstrative way of women who respect each other without requiring much maintenance. She was 4 years younger than her brother, practical and plain-spoken, working as a high school vice principal in Langley. She did not call me to chat. When she did call, she meant it. She said she needed to tell me something and that she hoped I would hear her out before saying anything. Then she told me about Vanessa. Vanessa was 32 years old and worked as a junior associate at the firm that handled Pacific Freight's contracts. She had started on the account 18 months earlier. My sister-in-law had met her twice at company events and had initially had no reason to think anything of it. Then she had seen them together at a cafe in Yaletown on a Wednesday morning when she was on her way to a professional development conference. She had watched them for long enough to be certain, and then she had driven to the conference and sat through 6 hours of presentations about restorative practices in schools. And then she had called me. I listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, there was a long silence on the line. "Thank you," I said. "Claire. I mean it. Thank you." She started to say something else and stopped. She said she was sorry. I told her it wasn't her fault. I told her she was a good person and that it had always been my privilege to be her sister-in-law, and I meant every word of it. I sat with the information for 3 days before my husband came home from a trip to Prince George and asked me to go to dinner at Ancora. I already knew what he was going to say before he said it. After I left the restaurant, I drove home and made tea and sat in the kitchen and did the mental accounting that I imagine most women in that situation do at some point. 23 years. The move we had made to be closer to his parents. The oncology job I hadn't taken. My grandmother's $85,000, which had become, through a combination of my husband's talent and both of our labor, a freight company now worth somewhere north of $4 million according to the last valuation. I was not angry, exactly. Or rather, the anger was there, but it was underneath something heavier and quieter, a kind of exhausted clarity, like the feeling after a long fever breaks and you see the room around you with absolute precision. I called our family lawyer the next morning. She had done our wills, our property agreements, and the original shareholder documentation. I told her the situation, and she listened, and then she asked me when I would like to come in. We met on a Tuesday. She pulled up the shareholder agreement on her screen and walked me through it carefully, though I had by then read it twice the night before myself. 40%. My name, clearly and without ambiguity, as a 40% owner of Pacific Freight Solutions Incorporated, established in exchange for an $85,000 capital contribution, formalized and signed by both parties. My lawyer said the agreement was enforceable and that it had never been dissolved or amended. She said my husband could certainly proceed with a divorce, but that doing so would trigger asset division proceedings under the BC Family Law Act, and that the shareholder agreement would be central to those proceedings. She said my 40% stake, given the current valuation, was not an insignificant number. I asked her to confirm the figure. She confirmed it. I drove home through the rain and I thought about my grandmother, who had arrived in this country with almost nothing and had spent 40 years turning almost nothing into something she could leave behind. I thought about the way she used to say that a woman should always know the value of what she has, even when no one else is paying attention. I hadn't forgotten. I'd just let myself stop looking. In the weeks after the restaurant, my husband and I occupied the house in a state of careful, terrible politeness. He had taken to sleeping in the guest room, which suited me. He was already beginning to move things, small things at first, books and a jacket and the good headphones he always used for travel, and I let him do it without comment. I watched him with the detached focus I had learned to bring to difficult patients, the ones who required calm more than comfort. My sister-in-law called again at the end of April. She had heard from her brother that the Pemberton contract signing was scheduled for May 15th. It would be held at the Hotel Georgia in downtown Vancouver, a formal event with the resource company's executives and a handful of other stakeholders. My husband intended to bring Vanessa. He had told his sister this himself, apparently without realizing she would tell me, or perhaps simply not caring anymore. He wanted to introduce her in a professional context first, my sister-in-law said. Ease her into the company's world. I thanked her again. And then I sat quietly for a while and thought. I want to be precise about what I decided and why. I did not want revenge in the theatrical sense of the word. I am a nurse practitioner. I have held the hands of people in the last hours of their lives. I have a fairly accurate sense of proportion. What I wanted was something simpler and harder to name. I wanted the people in that room to know the truth of what had built that company. I wanted my husband, for once, to look at the actual cost of the choices he had made. I called my lawyer. I asked her about my rights as a shareholder with respect to the Pemberton signing. She told me that as a 40% owner of Pacific Freight Solutions Incorporated, I had not only the right but arguably the standing to be present at any major contractual event affecting the company's valuation. I asked her if she would accompany me. She said she would. I dressed carefully on the morning of May 15th. I wore the charcoal blazer I had bought for my own hospital's board presentations, the one that fit well and made me feel like myself. I had stopped coloring my hair the previous winter, a decision I had made quietly and kept, and the silver had grown in faster than I expected, not gray exactly, but a kind of cool, pale silver that caught the light in a way I had not anticipated. Several of my colleagues at the hospital had commented on it. One of the younger nurses had asked me how I'd gotten it done. I told her it was natural. She didn't believe me. I met my lawyer in the lobby of the Hotel Georgia at 11:30. She was carrying a slim leather folio. We took the elevator to the conference level and found the room without difficulty. Pacific Freight's name was on the placard outside the door. My husband was already inside. He was standing near the window with two men I didn't recognize and a woman I recognized from the company's LinkedIn profile as the resource company's director of operations. He was laughing at something, relaxed and confident in the way he always was in professional settings, and for a brief moment I felt the old familiar pull of pride in him that I had carried for so long it had become indistinguishable from the air I breathed. Vanessa was standing slightly behind him. She was younger in person than in her firm's photo, fine-featured and carefully dressed, with the particular alertness of someone performing composure. She was holding a glass of water and watching the room the way junior associates do at events where they know they are being evaluated. My husband saw me at the same moment I stepped fully through the door. The color left his face so completely and so instantly that it looked almost medical. I had seen that particular pallor before, in patients receiving information they had not prepared for. I watched him process it, the calculation behind his eyes, the rapid assessment of how this was possible, what it meant, what it changed. I walked toward him steadily. My lawyer stayed half a step behind me. Claire. He said my name the way you say a word you weren't expecting to need. Good morning, I said. I looked at Vanessa briefly and gave her a small, unremarkable nod, the kind you give to strangers at professional events. I hope the signing goes well. I wanted to be here. He lowered his voice. What are you doing here? My lawyer spoke then, quietly, and without drama. She introduced herself by name and explained, in the measured, even tone of someone who has done this many times, that she was present as counsel for Claire Henderson, 40% shareholder of Pacific Freight Solutions Incorporated, and that her client had a vested interest in observing any contractual arrangement affecting the company's valuation. She opened the folio and placed the shareholder agreement on the table beside us. 4 pages. Signed by both parties. Notarized and dated. The director of operations from the resource company had drifted closer. She was looking at the agreement on the table with the expression of someone doing a rapid recalculation. My husband said something in a low voice that I didn't catch. He was looking at my lawyer, not at me. Vanessa had gone very still. It was the director of operations who asked the question that changed the temperature of the room. She asked, in the careful way of someone choosing words deliberately, whether she was understanding correctly that Pacific Freight had an unresolved shareholder situation. My lawyer said that the situation was not unresolved so much as undisclosed. She said this gently but without apology. The resource company's lead executive, a heavyset man with a gray beard who had been standing near the coffee service, came over to see what was happening. Someone explained it to him. He looked at my husband with an expression that was not anger exactly, but something closer to a door closing. There was a long pause. Vanessa set her glass of water on the table. She looked at my husband with an expression I recognized. I had seen it in patients' family members when they realize the prognosis is worse than the doctor first suggested. It was the look of someone revising what they believed to be true. She picked up her bag from the chair beside her. She put on her jacket. She said something quiet to my husband that I couldn't hear. And then she walked out of the room. My husband watched her go. He stood very still with the shareholder agreement on the table in front of him, and he watched the door close behind her, and I thought for a moment that he was about to say something to me, something real. The kind of thing that had stopped being said between us so gradually we hadn't noticed it happening. He didn't say it. The Pemberton signing was postponed indefinitely. The resource company's director called my lawyer the following week to say that her team had some concerns about Pacific Freight's corporate governance structure that they wanted to resolve before proceeding. My lawyer said she understood completely. I moved out of the house in Burnaby in June. I had found a 2-bedroom apartment in Kitsilano, close enough to the hospital that I could walk on nice mornings, which there were more of than I had remembered. My sister-in-law helped me move. We rented a cargo van and drove back and forth 3 times. And at the end of the day, we sat on the floor of my new living room eating pad thai from containers, and she told me that her brother had called her angry and that she had told him he could stay angry as long as he liked. I laughed. It was the first time I had laughed properly in months, and it surprised me with its volume. The divorce proceedings took just under a year. My lawyer was meticulous and patient, and the shareholder agreement held exactly as she had said it would. My 40% stake was valued, appraised, and accounted for in the settlement. I didn't end up with the shares themselves, neither of us wanted that ongoing entanglement, but the settlement reflected their value accurately and completely. I took a position at BC Cancer that fall, the kind of nurse practitioner role I had turned down years earlier. The hours were demanding in a way that felt purposeful rather than draining. I had patients who were dealing with things far harder than anything I was navigating, and there was something clarifying about that, something that helped me stay oriented. I stopped coloring my hair. I had already stopped, but I stopped thinking about stopping. The silver grew in fully by December, and I stood in front of the bathroom mirror one morning in the apartment and looked at it for a long time. It was, I thought, the most honest I had looked in years. My grandmother had gone silver young, too. She had always worn it without apology, the way she wore most things without apology, without explanation, as a simple fact about herself that required no management. I thought about her often that year. I thought about the money she had left me and what it had built and what it had cost and what it had finally returned to me, in the end. I thought about the way she used to say that a woman should always know the value of what she has. I knew. Now. My husband called me once, in November, about 6 months after the Hotel Georgia. He called from a number I didn't recognize, which I think was intentional, and I answered because I didn't know not to. He said he wanted to talk. I said I was listening. There was a long pause, and then he said something about regret, and about time, and about not fully understanding the value of something until it was gone. I let him finish. I think, I said carefully, that you understand value very well. You always have. I just wasn't in the category you were paying attention to. He didn't have anything to say to that. I wished him well, and I meant it, in the way you can mean something and still know that it no longer requires you. I hung up and stood in my kitchen with the November rain coming down outside and the city spread out below my window, gray and familiar and full of the particular kind of quiet that comes after a long season of noise. My grandmother's $85,000 had become a settlement that let me buy the Kitsilano apartment outright and put money aside in my RRSP and still have enough left to take a trip to Scotland in the spring, to the part of the country she had come from. I wanted to see it. I wanted to stand somewhere she had stood before she became the woman who would come to Canada and build something from nothing and leave it to me. I went in April. I drove a small rental car through the highlands on roads that were barely wide enough for one vehicle, past locks that looked painted and hills that looked ancient and small stone buildings that had been there longer than anyone could easily comprehend. I stayed in a farmhouse bed and breakfast outside Inverness, and the woman who ran it had silver hair like mine and made porridge from scratch every morning and set it on the table without the way you set down something you've been making all your life. On my last morning there, I walked down to the edge of a small loch near the property, alone in the early morning light. The water was very still and very dark, and the hills reflected in it so perfectly that up and down seemed like a matter of opinion. I stood there for a long time thinking about nothing in particular, which is a thing I had not been able to do in years. I thought about my grandmother crossing the Atlantic in 1962, 31 years old and carrying everything she owned in 2 cases. I thought about her arriving at Pier 21 inches Halifax and stepping off the ship into a country she had only ever read about, deciding with every step that she was going to be all right, that she was going to be more than all right, that whatever came next was not going to diminish her. She never told me that in so many words. But I had always known it about her. It was the things she had left me, more than the money, more than the shareholder agreement, more than any of the material accounting. Know what you have. Don't let anyone make you forget it. The morning light came across the loch in long horizontal lines. Somewhere up the hill behind me, the farmhouse woman was starting breakfast. I could smell it distantly: bread, coffee, something warm and unpretentious and real. I turned around and walked back up the hill. I was going to be all right. I was going to be more than all right.